Half Church of God, half castle against the Scot. The ancient city of Durham is completely dominated by its cathedral, a mighty Norman building perched high on a rock. It is certainly one of the great architectural splendors of the Western world, and whether you glimpse it from afar or see it close to, the impression is one of overwhelming grandeur. Even so, it's still a working church. Apart from the many special occasions, there are at least 3 regular services of worship each day. And certainly the Benedictine monks who were once here would approve, because their mission in life was to serve God with prayer and praise and thanksgiving. The cathedral was built to house the shrine of St. Cuthbert, who died on the 20th of March, 687, and to be the church of the Benedictine monks, whose responsibility was to care for this place of pilgrimage. Cuthbert's body was brought from the holy island of Lindisfarne, where it had been for almost 200 years. But when the Vikings came in their long ships to raid the monastery, the monks were forced to find somewhere safer for the body of St. Cuthbert. Eventually, in 995, they settled in Durham. On a rocky hill they began building their stone church, and by 999 Cuthbert's body was put in its new resting place, and the building was consecrated. Later, in 1093, the Normans pulled this church down and laid the foundations of the present building, and the main part of this monastic church was completed by 1133.
Whoso dwelleth under the defence of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say unto the Lord, Thou art my hope and my stronghold. My God, in him will I trust. For he shall deliver thee from the snare of the hunter, and from the noisome pestilence. He shall defend thee under his wings, and thou shalt be safe under his feathers. His faithfulness and truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Thou shalt not be afraid for any terror by night.
This cathedral was built not for the use of people from the neighborhood, but as the chapel of a Benedictine monastery. We are often asked how many monks there were, and the answer is never more than about 70. And people then go on to the further question, why did they need such an enormous chapel for so small a number of monks? And especially, why did they need such a lofty building? And the answer is twofold. It is firstly that the building was put up not just for use, but also to the glory of God. And the more magnificent the building, the greater the glory. And the second and minor reason was that an important part of monastic services on Sundays and holy days was a procession, and they liked to have plenty of room for the procession to circulate in a dignified way. As we stand at the west end of the nave of the cathedral, almost everything that we can see clearly was built in the space of 40 years, round about the year 1100. And a simple calculation shows that about 400,000 tons of stone was involved. If we work out the tons per week, it comes to a remarkable figure, at least 200 tons a week. We can be certain that the builders of that time knew how to use a single pulley with a rope over it, that they understood the use of levers and wedges, but there was a great deal of pushing and shoving and hard work. And one of the mysteries is, where did the necessary pairs of hands come from? The population of the whole of England was small then, and the population of Northumbria was, of course, a very small fraction of what it is now. We notice the enormous size of the pillars, the great thickness of the walls, and the almost complete absence of decoration. What we see is one of the finest examples of 12th century architecture, which we usually call Norman, that can be found in this country. Some people would say even in the whole of Europe. We're reminded also of the fact that this was a monastic chapel by the existence of a boundary mark in the floor, a long strip of marble with a short cross arm on it. That was the boundary eastward of which women were not supposed to penetrate in monastic times. Women did sometimes penetrate to the eastern end of the cathedral, but if they were detected, they were ignominiously turned out. Outside each of the doors of the cathedral, there is a very substantial iron gate reaching right up to the top of the door. These gates have nothing to do with monks or the Middle Ages. They were all put up shortly before the First World War as precautions against the activities of militant suffragettes. There is a connection between St. Cuthbert and the sanctuary knocker. The whole institution of sanctuary has a very long history, and it was very widespread over Europe. The basis of it was the theory that all consecrated ground should provide a place of refuge for people who were pursued by the representatives of the law or by people seeking private vengeance. And Durham was a particularly favored place of sanctuary, partly because of the great reputation of St. Cuthbert. For anybody who broke into the cathedral to drag out or to kill someone who had taken refuge there under the protection of St. Cuthbert was supposed to be in danger of incurring the personal wrath of the saint himself. During the daytime, there was presumably no difficulty about claiming sanctuary, but the knocker was provided for the use of anyone who arrived during the night. A few steps from the west end of the cathedral take us into the Galilee Chapel, which, architecturally speaking, is of interest because it was built about 75 years later than the nave, and we can see the change in style which occurred in that period, a change in the direction of lightness. It's just as well that the Galilee Chapel is in a lighter style, because it reaches out to the very edge of the precipice, where there is almost a sheer drop to the river, and had it been built in the same style as the nave, it probably would not have stood at all. The second reason why the Galilee Chapel is important is because it contains a tomb which is said to be that of the Venerable Bede. Bede was noted above all other things, although he was a monk and a man of a holy life, noted as a great scholar and a great teacher. Moving towards the east end of the cathedral, if we pause where the transepts intersect the aisles, we can see 400 years of English architecture, from the 12th century, the so-called Norman style, at the extreme west end, through the lancet window of the 13th century, to the decorated window in the north transept, and the 15th century window in the south transept.
We have a peal of bells. We had 8 bells. These had to be taken down and repaired. We've added 2 new bells so that we now have 10 bells. Well, some people like bells, other people don't, but at least they call people to worship and they do make a joyful noise. As Dean of Durham, I stand in a succession of deans, and before them of priors of Durham, and these priors were Benedictines, and the rule of St. Benedict involved primarily the worship of God, and also an emphasis on hospitality, and also on manual work. We now have a restaurant, mentioned in one of the good food guides actually, and so people come to eat here. But also the hospitality we offer to the thousands of visitors who come just to see the place. We welcome them, we try and make them at home, we show them around, so that when they go away, they feel they're glad to have been at Durham, because the Durham people are people who welcome them. The manual work, we employ a number of craftsmen here, stonemasons and joiners, and they carry on looking after the cathedral. We've just started a 25-year schedule of work in repairing the cathedral stones. So it's a living thing and not just belonging to the past.
From the ends of the earth will I call upon thee. When my heart is in heaviness, who set me up upon the rock that is higher than I? O thou hast been my hope, and a strong tower for me against the enemy. I will dwell in thy tabernacle forever, and my trust shall be under the covering of thy wings.
The cloister was a very important place in the life of monks, for round it, daily life of the monastery revolved. On one side, the northern side, where it helped to keep off the coldest of the winds, there was the monastic chapel. On the southern side, the building, which is now part of the chapter library, which was the monks' refectory or dining room, and closely adjacent to it, the kitchen. There is even the medieval serving hatch still visible. The dormitory in Durham was on the western side of the cloister, and it now forms part of the chapter library, and it is also partly a museum.
And to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
The library represents the continuing of the Benedictine tradition of study and learning, and indeed part of the library consists of 300-odd manuscripts, which are the remains of the monks' own library, and some of the manuscripts were ones which they themselves copied, and in the margins of many of them there are notes written by the monks themselves in their own hand. The two other sections of more ordinary books are the early printed books. They are used by scholars, people doing research of one kind and another, and the modern 19th century and 20th century books. The more modern books are all kept in the dormitory, which was where the monks used to sleep, which is an enormous room with a very fine 14th century wooden roof, still as it always has been. And the books are used as an ordinary borrowing library by the undergraduates and other members of the university. The treasury is the newest bit of the cathedral. It was opened in 1978, and it's an attempt to deal with two problems. The first is that we have a considerable number of very valuable things which are unique, and they have to be kept somewhere, and they need special conditions for their safekeeping. That's one problem. The other problem about them is that if we keep them at all, we ought to enable people to see them, and it's very good if they are kept and seen, that they are seen in the place where they belong. The most important thing in the treasury is certainly the remains of St. Cuthbert's coffin, because there would be no cathedral or anything else here if it wasn't for the fact that Cuthbert was buried here and the building was built to protect his shrine. We also have some unique embroideries which were given to St. Cuthbert's shrine in the 10th century, in 934, and they are said to be the only surviving examples of this kind of embroidery in the whole of Western Europe. The other kinds of things we have, which are also extremely valuable but in a slightly different way, are the two sets of altar plate, one of which belongs to the cathedral and dates from the middle of the 18th century, from 1760s, and another set which was made by Bishop Cousin for his use in his chapel at Alton Castle in the 1660s. And we are able actually to use them for the purpose for which they were originally made. The third group is the manuscripts, and we have just a small number of them from the collection, which are displayed in the treasury so that people can appreciate the beauty of the illumination and the quality of the writing. And also we have two manuscripts with the original 12th century binding, and the binding is displayed so that people can appreciate that as well.
The chapter house is an extremely lofty building. That was used for the daily business meeting of the monastery, and it got the name of chapter house because it was the custom for one chapter out of the Book of Rules to be read daily. On the northern side of the cloister, there was a row of desks and seats for monks who had a special talent for writing to spend a good deal of their time in copying books. Benedictine monks made a speciality of books. We can still see the marks on the wall showing where the bookcases were fixed. When we move into the choir, it is a very good time to think again about the monks for whom this cathedral was built, because most of their services were held in the choir. The monks believed that their work in life was to keep up a regular series of services of praise, prayer, and thanksgiving, day in, day out, all the year round. At least 7 services every day, services which began soon after midnight and continued at intervals until the last service in the evening. Their day was divided very roughly into 3 more or less equal parts: 1/3 for sleep, 1/3 for worship, and 1/3 for other forms of work. Daily services are held today, right through the year, and in fact, there is a very strong connection between the services of the monks and the services that are held now. The great difference is, of course, that the monastic services were in Latin and the present-day services are in English. But a good deal of the material which formed the services of the monks was incorporated in the English Book of Common Prayer. Towards the eastern end of the choir, there is the bishop's throne, a very imposing structure put up at the command of Bishop Hatfield in the 14th century. He was very anxious that everybody who saw it should realize that the bishops of Durham were very important people. And so he said he was going to have the highest bishop's throne in the world. Still further eastwards, behind the big screen, which itself stands behind the high altar, there is the grave of St. Cuthbert. And it's impossible to overrate the importance of St. Cuthbert in the history of Durham. And St. Cuthbert's reputation for a holy life and for wisdom was so great that some of it was inherited by his successors, the bishops of Durham.
I have known and loved Durham Cathedral for 40 years. First, there were the 10 years when I was a canon of the cathedral, as well as professor in the university, and later came the 4 years when I was bishop. Through the years there have been many pilgrimages to the shrine of St. Cuthbert near the East End, and to the shrine of the Venerable Bede in the Galilee at the West End. They were saints who lived near to heaven while being deeply involved in the turmoil of this world. The monks are no longer, but the canons are called to be a praying community who together, day by day at the altar of God, pray for our troubled world. Many others join in prayer and worship in the services, especially on Sundays, and it is hoped that visitors are moved to pray when they visit the great church.
Now, I see the prime function of the cathedral is really to worship God. Of course, you can worship God in any way you like. You can worship Him in bed, or you can worship in an ordinary room. But this cathedral points us to the sheer majesty and glory and splendor of God, and that this world in which we live, as God's world, is in fact a glorious world. It also, I think, points to the fact that men, when they want to offer their thanksgiving and praise to God, give of their best, and this cathedral is a splendid place, and you can just look around and see of the best which men in the past have given.
Yet in the bravest prize of all may claim the Star of Bethlehem, Jesus, blessed be his name. Then not is good, but paradise word of the Sibelius, we sing, O drum and timbrel, and the tender soothing flute. We sing, O drum and timbrel, and the tender soothing flute. O Jesus, Lord, my ear, and will my bliss complete. Make thou my heart thy garden, not Patri and deeds, that I may hear this music clear of the Sibelius. We sing, O drum and timbrel, and the tender soothing flute. We sing, O drum and timbrel, and the tender soothing flute.
Sing